I good? All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our talk today. My name is Goldstein, and I'm the practice director of incident response and forensics for a company called Silence. So in the keynote a little earlier today, they were talking about the OPM data breach and how it kind of revolutionized the way that cyber threats are emerging. And that was actually something that my team handled and responded to. So we were the primary responders, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit today. So that was an awesome segue into the talk. I'm really glad you were able to make it. For those that have, for just a quick little introduction about myself. So my name's Goldstein. I've been doing incident response consulting for about 8 years, in security for 11. I've worked for 3 of the largest incident response consulting firms in the U.S. Let's see here. I've responded to over 10 countries, 150 incidents at least. That's probably on the low end. So I've seen some things. I spent a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure out what the hackers did, what they stole, how they did it. I've seen some very creative attacks and some not so creative attacks. And so that's what I'm here to talk about is, over the last 10 years or so, I've seen this kind of shift in response from a traditional role to these new ways that we need to be responding to threats if we want to stay ahead of the bad guys. I went to school at UCF, University of Central Florida, if anyone's from Florida. No? All right, go Knights. All right. Yeah, and certifications, my last company gave me a lot of SANS certs, and that's always nice. But for the most part, I've worked in incident response consulting, and then prior to that, I spent 2.5 years running incident response and threat intelligence for a company called ANYCon, which is one of the largest biotech companies in the U.S. So a lot of different types of attacks, a lot of different interesting things. But first, let's talk about, how did it work originally? What was the old threat landscape like? What were these attacks? How were we responding, and why? So if you think about it, it was really kind of what I call a shotgun attack, kind of like spam. They want to spread their malware, spread their fraud as far and wide as they could, kind of throw it at the wall, see what sticks. Sometimes they're going to get a good target and they're going to be able to extract a lot of money or information. Sometimes it's going to be a smaller company or a personal individual and you're not going to get much. So all of these attacks were not very targeted. It was, if you were a victim, it was because you had an open port or something that was that made you a victim. Same thing, they were attacking low-hanging fruit. So anytime a new major vulnerability came out, people started scanning the internet, looking for it. Think MongoDB. So if any of you aren't familiar, MongoDB several years ago had a vulnerability where their databases were publicly listening if you didn't reconfigure their configuration script. So people would go on Shodan and look for MongoDB, and here is treasure troves of private information that everyone could look at. Once again, it's not targeted. I couldn't say, hey, I want this company's information, but I could say, hey, out of all of the people that have it open, maybe 1 or 2 of these are a real target. And they were reusing the same malware and exploit kits all the time. There's no real customization. You could buy an exploit kit and it would be the same one that would be purchased by the other users. And all of this malware was static, right? So the same piece of malware infected each person. There was no real creativity to it. And that, it still gave us a run for our money. I mean, when Conficker came out, I was up till 4 a.m. fighting it, just like a lot of other people were. I'm not saying that this old threatscape wasn't effective. It just wasn't as refined as it has become. The other things to make the old threat landscape a little unique, there was no destruction. Man, those were the days. You could do an investigation of somebody that got hacked or somebody that had a data breach, and you would not find that your security event logs were wiped or somebody is debanning a system or wiping all of the artifacts from the system before you can get a chance to do your forensics on it. So none of that existed. Even if you think Shamoon, so Shamoon was a piece of malware that attacked primarily the oil and gas industry, and after it infected systems, it wiped your MBR. Like across the board. So entire oil companies, especially in like the UAE and other locations like that, they would come into work and all of their systems are literally powered off. There's no more operating system, no more data. So this wasn't something that you had to worry about back then. I think the Sony attack was one of the first times that was really seen in the wild in a large scale. So like I was mentioning, they're not targeting, they're using spray and pray tactics to infect as far and wide as they can. And if you think about it, the skill set to do these types of attacks was much higher. You couldn't go onto a forum and say, hey, here's my current exploit, here's my target. How do I get this to work? Or watch a YouTube video on, how to run Metasploit and create your own binaries. None of this was as easily available. Of course, there's communities and ways to learn, but it wasn't as prevalent, which means you had to have a higher skill set as a barrier to entry. And the tutorials and tools were not as easy to find. So with that, it was kind of an interesting response because while we knew what they were doing, we had a specific set of methodology and a specific tool set to investigate all of these types of breaches. But it's gotten a little different. If you talk about the actual forensic and incident response approach, the same traditional techniques were also there. So what would happen is a piece of malware would come out, and what would you have to do? Well, let's create an AV signature for it. Let's get a fingerprint of that piece of malware. Let's go make an IDS alert for Snort or whatever tool you're using. So that way, if we see that piece of malware or this attack again, we can at least identify it, because that's the whole point, is we need to be able to identify threats and respond to them effectively. This is a very reactive approach. Wait till you get hacked and then create a signature to identify it. Well, that's, unfortunately pretty ineffective. The average time to a data breach is, 3 to 6 months before it's detected. So that means an attacker typically has 3 to 6 months in your environment doing anything they want, whether it's recon or data exfiltration or any of the other stuff that I'll show you in an attacker kill chain. They had all of this available to them while you're, working and doing your day-to-day work. There was no detection. And then once you did get the alert or a trigger or something happens and they notified the team, the security team has to go and create forensic images. How many of you recognize the picture on the right here as far as a forensic write blocker and the techniques used to do this? So the traditional approach, and I'm no stranger to this, I used to do this all the time. When you're an incident responder, even a couple years ago and even now in some firms, you're going to show up to a client. They're going to say, hey, we've been hacked. We've got this problem. And you're going to fly out to wherever they are. And you're going to bring this little device with you. It's a forensic write blocker. So what this does is it allows you to create a forensic copy of a hard drive without writing anything to it. So it allows you to read but blocks any writes. And the goal there is to make sure that you have proper preservation of evidence. So this is the only way that you can make it admissible in court. Because otherwise, when you turn on your system, when you shut down your system, when you're doing reads and writes, you're altering that evidence. But this is a slow approach. So for one system, if I've got a 500 gig hard drive, I plug it into this device, I basically start my copy, and I can go disappear for about 4 to 6 hours. Like, it's a slow process. And so while it works, you can then take that full copy. We do hash verification, of course, to make sure that the copy we made is an exact identical match to the original. And that's great. This was the traditional approach. But what happens when you have more than 5 systems that are compromised, right? So this works for one. That little device is $900 a pop. But what happens when you have 50 devices or 100, or now we're talking hundreds of thousands of systems? This is not effective. We cannot keep doing it this way. So I'm not here to say that the traditional approach doesn't work. It is a proven and effective method, but it does not work with today's standards and the size and relevancy of today's data breaches. So what we have is, an old approach that works, but we need to be more effective. As I've been saying, our attacks are different, and we need to adapt. So these are some figures based off of some statistics that PhishMe put out. Other than the first one, so my company, and I'm not here to sell you anything. Trust me, that's not what I'm here for. My company works in incident response. We do have some machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities to identify malware that are incredibly effective, and we will talk about that. But what happens is when I have a client call me for incident response, 90% of them, when we go in and do an incident, 90% of them have malware on their network that was never identified prior. That means of all of the clients we have, 9 out of 10 of them have some form of malware in their environment that their traditional antivirus, that their other tools just don't see. Like, let's be honest, there's a red team track going on over there. I'm sure I could ask them, how hard is it to evade traditional antivirus? Okay, so that gives you an idea of how ineffective a lot of our approach is. The rest of these were all from PhishMe. 93% of spear phishing attacks now contain ransomware. That's insane. and they're up 800% since the previous quarter. So in the last quarter, really in the last 2 quarters, all of you have probably seen phishing attacks in your environments. Some of it's real nasty. It's got really nasty ransomware. Other times they're stealing credentials. I'm seeing a lot of CEO fraud. So what you'll get is somebody that's phishing or spear phishing a high value target. And once they have those credentials, they're actually logging into Office 365 or OWA, whatever they have, and they're creating inbox rules. So if the email contains the word fraud or transfer or other things, it goes to this inbox or a special folder that nobody else, that the user isn't going to notice, or in the deleted message. So now the attackers can send emails to others inside the environment saying, hey, initiate this wire transfer. Here's an invoice you need to pay. And then when somebody says, are you sure this seems a little fishy or fraudulent to me? It goes automatically to a special inbox where they can reply, no, this is totally cool. You should send that money. I need that $400,000. And so it's a totally different landscape now. 89% of the breaches that we're seeing have a financial or espionage motive. It's not about, hey, let's just put our name on somebody's website anymore. It's not defacing. This is financially motivated. And 99% of the malware can be stopped with AI. That's a little salesy in my opinion. I probably would strike that, but the graphic is nice, so I didn't want to get rid of it. But the real point is, if signature is dead, artificial intelligence and machine learning can identify malware very effectively, 99%. So let's talk about the current landscape, and then we're going to talk into some actual examples of what we're fighting and how we're fighting it. What we're seeing are persistent and motivated attackers. They're picking a target and they're sticking with it. So I focus a lot in enterprise advanced persistent threats. These are typically nation states that are focused on stealing a specific set of data or espionage and things like this. So what happens is when you become a target, you will be attacked left and right, day and night. Doesn't matter what you do. Whether it's spear phishing attacks to gain credentials or spread their malware, they will be very effective. We're seeing voicemail calls and phone calls now as being a newer entry as well. They're trying to gain information to leverage for their email attacks. And that's another thing that the red team, we could probably talk about it a little more on the social engineering side. But it's a really cool idea because for the attackers, it's a really cool idea because now they've got a specific target. They don't have to hope that they've got this high value target. They're going to go for that multi-billion-dollar company or that company that's doing really good research. These types of things happen all the time. We're seeing investment and CFO level intrusions happening to get insider knowledge to do stock trading and insider tips. Looking for information about mergers and acquisitions so they can beat everybody to market and actually use this information to gain a lot of money. So this is very targeted. We're not talking about somebody that's breaking into the network and, mass network scanning. They know what they're looking for. They know what file server it's on. They know what the file names are. So whether they have somebody on the inside or they've just done their research, you're not going to see a lot of the exploration. They are going for a specific target. And then once you get rid of them, once you get that alert on whatever IDS tool you have or AV or whatever it is that triggers it, when you respond and you finally wipe them out, which can take, upwards of months in some cases, when you finally wipe them out, the next day they go right back to spear phishing again. They mix up their tools. They've literally just got a list of tools and they say, okay, well, this one's been burned. Let's go to the next set. And it makes sense. It's just, you don't really think that this is happening in a large scale, but it really, really is. And then now we're seeing advanced extortion tactics too. So ransomware and scareware. Ransomware, we all know what ransomware is. It's essentially, holding your data for hostage and saying, give us money or your data's gone. Scareware can be the same thing, but scareware is typically, it's confusing older people, in my opinion, people that are less educated as far as newer technology scams. This one is, my mom gets this type of attack. And she'll go to a website and it will say, oh, the FBI has detected malicious activity on your system. To avoid prosecution, give us $300 in Walmart gift cards. And unfortunately, these things happen. And so while scareware isn't something that's targeting corporations typically, it's enough that they're making enough money to keep going. And then other things, advanced infection vectors are huge these days. We're getting cross-platform malware. So these developers decide, hey, you know what? Not everyone's running Windows. Or, it would be great if I could not only compromise their computer, but I bet their phone has a lot of good information on it too. In one case, we actually saw an attacker compromise a phone and then access the two-factor codes from that phone to further their crimes. It was pretty, to me, as a responder, while I'm upset that I'm working real late, working on these things, I'm also kind of impressed. Like, at a certain point, some of these investigations, like, damn, that's actually pretty cool. Like, I wish I would have thought of that. So that's what we're working with, is cross-platform malware, stuff that's going to actually attack not just your computer, but maybe your phone or maybe your home computer or your tablet, things like that. And then we've got metamorphic and polymorphic malware. So polymorphic malware you might have heard of already. This is any kind of malware that when it goes from one system to another, the signature, the file and the code specifically, segments of it actually change a little bit. So your file hashes and your signatures change also. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but the idea is if you're using a signature AV to detect this type of thing, you're not going to, because you're going to pick up one, a week after it's there, and then you're going to find that you had 30 other instances as your updates start coming in with older signatures. So you're getting that. And then metamorphic malware is very similar, except the entire code base changes. So now we're not talking about sections of code. We're not talking about the persistence mechanisms change. We're talking about pretty much the entire piece of malware changes each time. So it can be a really interesting way. It can make for a long night for a lot of incident responders. So I'm going to talk about some of the current threats that my team faces, and then we'll talk about how we can actually stop this, detect it faster, and get to the good stuff. Quackbot. Anyone remember Qbot from 2007, 2008? This is not something new. This is a piece of malware that, if you mark my words, in the next 2 months, you will hear about this again. No joke, I have 14 open cases of large companies across pretty much every vertical open with this piece of malware right now. This is an old piece of malware, like I mentioned, that somebody has slightly modified, and it is going crazy. So the way this works is, first and foremost, it's polymorphic, which means not only does the code change, but the file names change, the detections change, and the run keys change. So from one system to another, you're not going to track it with traditional AV. Okay. The next thing is it accesses Windows credential stores. So what it's doing is grabbing your cached credentials and then reaching out to everything on your network and saying, hey, can I access this? Cool. Spread my malware and start over. Can I access this? Great. Awesome. Do it again. Can I access this? No. Log on failed. So when that happens enough times, what this does is it actually generates tons of account lockouts because it's trying to authenticate against everything. So what you have are, as an IT administrator, you're going to come in one day and all of a sudden you have, 15,000 account lockouts and your help desk is going crazy and you don't know what the hell's going on. So you end up calling my company or a company like ours, and we're going to say, well, sounds like you've got Quackbot. And you've got a real problem if you're just using antivirus to find this, because you're not going to. Once again, not a sales thing, but I have responded to probably the top 5 main antiviruses in each company that's hired us, and it's bypassed every single one of them. And it's not a shot at any particular one. It's just the reality here is that it's bypassing things because it's so heavily packed, it's obfuscated, and it uses polymorphic malware. Okay, and so since it spreads so fast, your entire network's going to get infected because at some point you have a network share that's, anonymous access, or you have the Windows file sharing service enabled and, it's not locked down fully. So it's going to spread like wildfire. You're going to be dragging you're going to be banging your head against the wall trying to unlock these systems. So the reality is what you can do is, I've actually created some scripts to go and find all of this and remove it. But the goal is you need to essentially either mass deploy a tool that's going to block it, or you need to actually go through every event 4771 looking for your lockouts to find out which systems are actually infected, causing your lockouts. This is a total pain. This was one of the worst headaches that I've seen for most of our clients in a long time. So I think there's been 2 recent articles in the last 3 weeks about this. We've been dealing with it for about a month now. I would be shocked if you don't start hearing more about Quackbot again. Then this is the fun one. How many of you have heard of SamSam or Samus? All right, so a couple. So this is ransomware, but this is what I call real ransomware. Your traditional ransomware is going to get on your system. You're going to get an email, hey, open this Excel file, click on this link, whatever it might be, and hey, your system is infected, pay us $1,000 in Bitcoin or a green dot card, whatever it might be, And okay, well, hey, you restore from backup or you lose your data. Not the end of the world for one system. This is what I call targeted ransomware. So this is opportunistic in the fact that the attackers, what they're doing is they're just doing mass internet scans for open remote desktop ports, and then they're just brute forcing it. And it sounds like it's not effective, but it's very effective. The other thing they're doing is there's a known JBoss exploit from, I want to say 2014 or 15. It's not new by any means. This is not a 0-day or anything like that. And what's happening is they're scanning for that, and it's a 3-line Python code to exploit. And they're breaking into the network. Okay, well, they're just like any other attacker at this point. They've found an entry point. They're in the network. But what they're doing is different. Now what they're doing is they're in the network, and they start fingerprinting everything. So they're going around looking for credentials. They'll use Mimikatz to dump them if they have to get domain admin. Once they have domain admin, they look at your data and your file shares to see what the value of that data is. And we're talking, entire networks. We're not talking about 5 or 6 systems. We're talking hundreds of systems here. So they will spend a week or 2 weeks or a month in the environment looking around and just, observing. Then what they do is they target the backups. So whether you're using a co-location or other types of backup systems, they're actually corrupting and bringing them down. I've seen them actually infect a co-location as well. It's pretty gnarly. So what they're doing is they destroy your backups, and they totally they disable the alerting. That way nobody finds out that the backups are gone. And then they wait. They'll wait for a month or so. That way your backups are now long gone. And they mass deploy with PSExec their custom ransomware across your entire environment. So you wake up the next morning and you go into your work, and every single computer on it has a message on it similar to, well, not that, that's actually the web portal, but has a message on it saying your data's encrypted. And these guys, they're not asking for $600 bucks here. They want between $50,000 and $100,000 in Bitcoin. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. If you want $600 in Bitcoin, pretty much anyone could go and get it. Go try today to go get $70,000 in Bitcoin, even if you have the money. It's not easy. It takes weeks in some cases for fraud and other things to go through to make sure. And some of my clients, they'll say, okay, well, what are our options? And I was like, well, so my team, we actually do stockpile Bitcoin for this purpose. I hate paying ransom. Don't get me wrong. It is the 100% last resort. I don't like giving anybody money, especially in this way. But in certain cases, this particular screenshot is an example. This was an architecture firm that on Christmas Eve, you can actually see the date on there is 12/26. On Christmas Eve, he walks in. He's like, hey, I walked in the office real quick just to check on something. The entire office is out until Tuesday. I just wanted to see something, and I noticed this. I need $60,000 in Bitcoin in the next 3 days, or all of our data is gone. So, hey, where's your backups? Oh, our backups are gone too. Shit. Okay, well, what do you do now? All right, so now we're talking about it, and in certain cases, we offered and we did pay the ransom for them. It's not something that we like to do, but it's something. It's that, or my client is literally walking out to the corner to some guy from local Bitcoins, with a briefcase full of $70,000, saying, "Hey, let's do this transaction." It's just not realistic. We can't have our clients doing that. We're going to end up in the news. So in this particular case, we offered, and you can see us. We're actually negotiating with the attackers in this point. They wanted 70,000. In this case, they wanted 28 Bitcoin total. Now, luckily, it wasn't quite as expensive as it is now. So I think in this case, it was about 40 grand they wanted. And essentially, we said, I don't trust anyone that's doing this, by the way. So I said, we'll pay you 14 Bitcoin. You give us half the keys to prove that you can decrypt this data. Once we can prove that, we'll pay the other 14 to actually finish up the transaction. And they did. Not only that, but they let us upload 2 files specifically just to prove that they did have the capability. You got a question?
I guess this portal is through like Tor or something.
Oh yeah, this is all on Tor. And this I had to redact a little bit just for client data, but yeah, so this is just an online message board where the ransom note says go to this website, and you can message them. In one case, I should have used the other screenshot. They apologized for the delay in providing me the decryption keys. Yeah. And so I always try to make a funny email account. You never want this attributed back to you, right? Or the company that you're doing this work for. So I always make a new Gmail account for it all. And on one of them, it was my data back would be great, thanks, at gmail.com. And like you got to find some kind of fun in doing this, because it's just, you feel dirty. Like it was worse because it was a Friday evening. It was, like I mentioned, it was Christmas Eve, and I was having a beer at the time, and I get the phone call, and I didn't even think about it. I was talking about paying ransom, and the table next to me at this restaurant looks at me like I'm crazy because I'm like, yeah, look, I'll get the $60,000 in ransom, and I'll take care of it. And these ladies are looking at me like, what is this guy doing? My girlfriend looks at me. She's like, Aaron, you gotta step outside for these kind of conversations. You're raising some eyebrows. So, it's one of those things where, it's back against the wall, and you don't want to become this client. Not only this, but there's other problems. If you do pay the ransom, what about auditors? So in the architecture firm, it's not such a big deal, but I had a healthcare company have the same problem. And when they pay, how do you know that the integrity of your data has been restored properly, right? There's a lot of compliance and regulatory issues with paying a ransom. Now, in this particular case, they would have lost 30 years worth of data, architecture, we're talking civil engineering plans, everything, if they didn't pay it. Their back was against the wall. But in reality, there's not much more you can really do. You have to either pay or come up with a backup. And in this particular instance, this is a custom piece of malware that's pretty nasty. Now, what I will say is the attackers have actually adapted to our response. So I always do half and half. I never believe in here's all the money up front. They've actually changed their ransom note to include you can pay us half up front and then half after. Yeah, that's what I said, right? Like, who says crime doesn't pay? Like, I thought that while it's, for the bad reasons, I was actually kind of proud of that. I was like, I made an impact on somebody's life today. Yeah, exactly. So these are the kinds of threats that we're facing now. The traditional response, you can go and image every single system in somebody's environment with one of these little write blockers, but it's not going to do anything. With one of these things, you can go in and do it, but your data's encrypted. They're using RSA 4096, I think. You're not decrypting that. Yeah, in 10 years from now, maybe, but for right now, it's just not happening. So we'll talk about approach. So when I joined Cylance, it was really a matter of, I was running IR for a big biotech. So we were focused mainly on nation state attacks, and there was plenty of them. But the approach was still the same methodology, the same, hey, let's go grab a forensic image, let's go do that. And I couldn't help but think, this is just not working. It's not effective, but I didn't know any better. And admittedly, Cylance was a vendor of ours. So I actually started talking to their incident response team, in a friendly level. And I learned about their approach and how they're doing things differently. And I'm not going to lie, I was like, I need to be part of that. So I straight up quit my job, and I hounded them for probably about 3 months before I ended up getting the job. And afterwards, I learned that the full stance of their methodology is just, it's totally different. And part of you, any of you that are experienced with incident response, as I'm going through this, you're going to say, no, this can't work. There's no way. And feel free to stop me. I'm happy to talk about it. But the idea is, instead of collecting a full forensic image off of every system, instead of grabbing 500 gigs or a terabyte of data per host, I want to do the least amount. I want to collect the least amount of information that I can. That's going to give me all of the context and relative data that I need to do my job. So this is where we created what we call the principle of least data. I don't know if we created that term. It sounds like somebody else probably created it a long time ago, but we're using it. The principle of least data. And it sounds cool, but it's true. The idea here is, let's collect only what we absolutely have to. Let's collect those forensic artifacts that we know will provide us, actionable results. So your MFT records, your registry files, ntuser.dats, all of these different types of records, event logs, all of this absolutely critical, don't get me wrong. But what I don't always need for every case is your full page file and all of these other artifacts that just your user profiles. I don't need all of it. So what we did was we tried to go through it and figure out exactly what we could use to make a fast collection without sacrificing quality of analysis. And so the idea is, we actually created some scripts to collect all of this information, and we'll talk about what we're collecting and why in a minute. But the goal here is, instead of doing a full forensic image and wasting 6 to 10 hours per host, now we have a script-based approach. I can give you a script for any operating system you have. Just off the top of my head, Windows, Linux, Solaris, Unix, OS X, and AS400. I had my guys write an AS400 script, just for anyone that runs into them once in a while. So we created all these scripts that essentially now, instead of doing a full forensic image, I say, okay, you've got Windows and Linux in your environment. Here's a shell script and here's a bat script. Go push this far and wide across your environment. I don't care which systems are infected. Run it on everything. And we're collecting about, with this first phase, we're collecting about typically 5 to 15 megabytes worth of data per host. Okay, and it's all in a compressed encrypted file. And once we have that data, we actually extrapolate it all into these relational databases that we've created. So now I can see very quickly, it doesn't matter if it's one host or 100,000 hosts, which we do, and we'll talk about. It doesn't matter how many hosts, the relative analysis time is still very small, because I can do 5,000 hosts and find the outliers about just as fast as I can do 10,000 hosts and find the outliers. So this is a scalable approach that helps with today's evolving threats. And so everybody has an anatomy of the attack slide, so I figured I'd throw mine in there too. Put it in the school the other day. I thought that was kind of cool. So essentially from the very beginning, the recon and the weaponization, spearfish, this is all happening before you ever know you're a target. Everything that we're looking for and what we wanted to capture in our collection script was everything that happens from the point the exploit or data ends up on your computer. Right? So from the moment of that phish or the moment of that malware, I want to find the exploit. I want to look for command and control. I want to look for persistence, and I want to look for stuff in memory. In addition, I want to see what processes and files are suspicious. I want to look if there's any kind of weird admin tools in your environment, psexec, other types of things that can be a legitimate admin tool, might not be. It really depends. So I want to go through all of these and classify everything and then talk to you about your environment. Are you using psexec? Is that legitimate? Cool. I will whitelist it across the board and not think twice about it. Okay, you're probably not using Mimikatz in your environment. We should probably talk about that. And the same thing from exfiltration. Do you have multiple split compressed files on your environment? Are there user profiles deleting across multiple accounts? All of these different things, if you look at this kill chain, these are all things that we should be looking for in our environments on a daily basis. So how do we do that? This is what our approach is. Now, once again, this is not a sales tactic, so apply these to your own incident response procedures. So what our goal is we want to look for 5 main areas that we feel capture pretty much every type of attack and exploit out there. Starting at the very bottom, these are the lowest risk. We're looking for network host and application configurations. So are you running Windows 2000 or Windows 2003, plugged into the internet with no patching? Yes, okay, they're low-hanging fruit. I'm not going to spend too much time on these, right? Malware and persistence mechanisms. So like I mentioned, we use machine learning and AI to detect malware every day. So we actually implemented that. Instead of just having an antivirus tool, we're using our API access on the back end to we're hashing common locations of malware in your environment, and we're running it through our engine to tell you if there's malware. Doesn't matter if you have another tool in place or not. We'll let you know what's not being detected by your current stuff. Same with persistence. So, registry keys, things like that. A lot of times, AV won't delete, it'll delete the binary, but it doesn't clean up after itself. It's not going to delete your dropped files and your persistence mechanisms, things like that. So I want to find all of those as well. I want to know what user accounts are doing what. So we do user account analysis as well. So I'm looking for lateral movement with an abusive admin credentials. In larger environments, I actually had, one of the guys on my team, former NSA guy, crazy smart, wrote his own machine learning technique called clustering on user accounts to basically group user accounts by activities based on event logs. So while it doesn't always say, hey, this user account's owned, it will say, here are the top 10 accounts doing the same type of activity. Here are another 10, and once in a while you'll find an outlier in there. So that's pretty neat. This isn't always a smoking gun, but it definitely helps give context. I want to know any command and control. So do the attackers have an established foothold in your environment? So I'm going to do threat intelligence. I'm going to pull NetSat information. All of this is going to be no appliance on the environment. I don't want to make an impact. The whole point of forensics, regardless of who it's for, is let's not tip off the attackers. Let's not, let them know we're investigating them. So I want to find all of this activity out as well. And then lastly, and it happens sometimes, but not too often, we'll find sabotage or data exfiltration. So exfiltration, like I mentioned, could be split compression, it could be tunneling, it could be a lot of different things. Sabotage is almost always either a PowerShell script or a scheduled task to delete forensic artifacts. So this might delete the entire system. It might use sdelete to wipe logs, all kinds of stuff like that. But if you look at this triangle, this is pretty much every single type of attack and type of abuse that we want to look for in an environment, regardless if it's me or you looking in your own environments, right? Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to find a type of attack that doesn't include one of these other than social engineering, but we'll talk about that later. Well, no, we won't, but there's no other talks about that. So in the keynote, it was mentioned about the OPM data breach. It just so happens that was the perfect setup because that was my team that responded to that. We were the ones that handled the Office of Personnel data breach. So any of you get your SF-86 compromised? A couple head nods, unfortunately. Well, I'm sorry about that. I'm definitely not a Fed. So if you're not familiar with OPM and what it is, it's essentially human resources for the federal government and armed forces. So if you think about it this way, if you ever get a security clearance of any kind, if you ever do government contracting, anything in that regard, they're going to ask you a ton of questions. They're going to collect a lot of information from you, including your fingerprints and maybe even some other types of samples, and they're going to store it all. But it's okay because you can trust the government, right? Okay. So, what was stolen? Let's talk about this for a minute. The way this worked was essentially the Office of Personnel Management was rolling out a proof of concept of our tool, our machine learning tool. And as a part of that proof of concept, they deployed it and started getting a lot of alerts, like ding, 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 like, hey, this is pretty bad, and like maybe we should look into this. So this wasn't a consulting experience. This wasn't a consulting engagement at all. This was just them deploying our tool and seeing if they like it to purchase it. And then they called us and said, hey, we found these interesting things. Does this mean anything? And we're like, well, this is a uniquely packed, no detection credential dumper. Yeah, I'd say that's probably something worth investigating. So 2 of our teammates flew out there and flew out to DC and sat in a dark, undisclosed room with full access to pretty much everything. And they found a lot of stuff. We'll talk about what they found, but let's talk about what the overall goal was for the attackers. We have determined that this was a nation-state attack. So what that means is we believe that a foreign intelligence group of an unknown country, we could talk about that maybe privately, broke into the Office of Personnel Management. And their entire goal was to steal sensitive information on employees, including the SF-86 is that really long document I was talking about that asks you everything you could ever want to know about a person, as well as the fingerprint data and some other stuff as well. They stole 20 million plus records. So pretty much everyone, by the time we caught them, they had their hands on pretty much everybody that has a record in the Office of Personnel Management. Think about it. That was not in the letter. You are correct. If you think current, former, and prospective federal employees. Now, if I'm a nation state, that could be pretty valuable, huh? If I want to know not just, hey, which people are known operatives, but what about those unknown operatives? They're still government employees. They all still have the same thing. And the way we found that, other than their mass amount of tools that were on the network, we also found split compression. So what they did was they harvested all of this data over a period of over 6 months, harvested it all, and then used WinRAR to essentially split it up into a bunch of small files to avoid detection. Now, those RAR files were encrypted, so we weren't able to actually decode all of that data, but we did hand it over to another 3-letter agency that probably has the computing power to crack a RAR file. So while I can't tell you exactly what that data was, I can tell you that the government knows what that data was. All right, so a couple quotes about this. So the former NSA senior counsel, this is a crown jewels material, a gold mine for foreign intelligence. And who can argue with that, right? I mean, it's got so much data. And then about 2 weeks ago, I had to update this, the title of this guy. My SF-86 lists every place I've ever lived since I was 18, every foreign travel I've ever taken, all of my family, their addresses. It's not just my identity that's effective. I've got siblings, I've got 5 kids, all of that is in there. So it's not just your data if you're a federal employee, it's your neighbors, your family, everybody that might be interviewed or talked to about your status was all in that document. And then, yeah, I had to add former director in here. A couple weeks ago, it wasn't that way. So So the real world impact, essentially they are now able to correlate, like I mentioned, known and unknown government agents. And so for us, that may not mean a lot, but I'm sure there's some CIA and some other people out there that are pretty pissed off that, somebody now knows that they're a spy. And not only that, but it was all foreign contacts and personal testimony. So every contact you've had in a foreign place. So if I was a CIA spy, let's just say, that'd be kind of cool. But if I was, I probably have a lot more access to information than I do now. But every foreign contact, every person that I'm doing trades with of intelligence, all of that data has to be documented. And all of that was compromised as well as personal testimony. So any of those internal investigations and all of the data within those investigations was also stolen. So let's talk about motive. All right, so why? Well, probably intelligence gathering. We don't know for certain. Obviously, we can't say for the unknown, but the reality was none of this data ended up for sale. And in a lot of the data breaches we do, we find the data for sale a couple weeks to a month later, which leads us to believe that a nation state is harvesting this information and using it for their own personal gain. This data, millions, if not billions of dollars worth of data. Think about the underground markets you could sell that to if you had that capability. So now we know what they did and we know what they did and why they did it. How did they do it? So, like I mentioned, they got us involved. We deployed to 10,000 plus systems in a matter of 48 hours. We pushed it far and wide. Normally, we do this in kind of a staged approach to not, to not make an impact, but clearly time was of the essence. So within 4 days, it was on every system in the Office of Personnel Management, and it was also in blocking mode, which means it doesn't matter if it was a true tool or not, if we thought it was malicious for any reason, it was blocked. I can't even get 100 instance clients to do this sometimes. How they did it that quick is beyond me. So it was a very bold undertaking to get the approval, especially in a very slow-moving government, to do that. They had a legacy antivirus. I'm not going to say which one. Semantic. It was deployed, and it didn't detect anything. We parsed all of those logs, and there was nothing. And you might say, oh well, it was maybe just a piece of malware or two, but the reality was it was a lot of malware. Let's talk about the timeline. They broke in. We believe, in June of 2014. By July and August, they were harvesting clearance information, so anyone that has a security clearance. Then in December, they were like, okay, well, that's good. Let's start taking personnel records. So not just clearance, but anyone that's working for the government. Then 2015, they decided to start taking the fingerprint data. And then, by June, 6 months later, that's when the public announcement occurred. So they had essentially a year. Well, it was about 9 months of full access to the environment, domain admin credentials across the board, in some cases, enterprise admin, literally anywhere they wanted to go, keys to the kingdom. And nobody noticed it until they were, deploying a proof of concept, hey, I wonder what this tool is, let's try it out. So, like I said before, it was no small undertaking. It was 10,000 hosts, but this also wasn't one piece of malware. We found 2,000 plus pieces of unique malware in their environment. Not only that, but we found all kinds of other stuff. We were able to find multiple different hacking groups that had broke in and started stealing their own sets of data and messing with each other. This was not just one group that managed to get in. They were a target for many. We finished our analysis in 48 hours. That script-based approach that I talked about, it works. We did 10,000 hosts in 48 hours. Try and do that with a forensic image. Encase couldn't even process that much data if we wanted to. So in 48 hours, we were able to identify all of the malware in the environment. Within a week, we told them every user account and every piece of malware that was in their environment, and provided a report, as well as some congressional testimony. But the funny part here is another 3-letter agency came in afterwards to go and do their own independent incident response. Of course, it's the government. They want to check themselves. They can't just trust a third-party vendor. They spent 3 months looking, and they didn't even find everything that we found. They didn't find a single thing we missed, but they didn't find everything that we found either in 3 months in a response that we took 48 hours for. So that's something. So how did this happen? There were a series of issues, a lot of issues. First and foremost, lack of adherence to standards. And this is where we're going to talk about improving your own incident response team and policy. First and foremost, some systems had all their security policies, others didn't. You had systems with no AV, some with other third-party unapproved AV, a little bit of everything. So there was no adherence to your standards. Multi-factor authentication didn't exist, which we all know is very important these days. So essentially, the hacker who was able to get in and actually exfiltrate the data managed to use compromised credentials to log in and do everything from that poor user account. I feel bad for whoever that was because he probably got in some trouble for that. Cybersecurity was not a priority. I mean, this shouldn't shock you for any government agency. Not a jab by any means. It's just there's a lot of other things going on, and security and technology typically take a back seat. Like I mentioned, multiple hackers were in there. They all had their own persistence and their own tool sets. It was actually pretty interesting to see. And they did not implement basic security requirements or controls. So not only did they not have the standards in some places, but they really just didn't have the technology in place to detect this. You know, legacy tools, not good training, et cetera. So some leadership failures as well. It was overlooked. I think it was a budgetary concern. But the goal or the idea here was that this was a major data breach impacting probably the most, it was probably one of the largest public data breaches to ever be announced at this point. There's been some larger healthcare at this in this endeavor, but this was huge. And I mean, at this point, it's a little dated. You know, it's 2015, but this is one of the only times that we can actually go public with a huge investigation, because literally my boss testified in Congress about this. And if you want to have a good laugh, read about some of that and read some of his quotes. He's a little rough around the edges. His name's Chris Coulter. He's a real smart guy, awesome guy. But in his congressional testimony, part of what's actually logged is him essentially saying all of our chats essentially of while we were talking about this incident and resolving it, they all had to be submitted to the government. And some of the creative wording that he used was made it into the congressional report. He's like, yeah, they're screwed, but he used some different wording. We always give him stuff. We give him crap about that because now there's a congressional report out there with our name on it, and the guy's like, yeah, we're effed. So anyway, that's a little side note. So all of that is great. Hey, look, silence is awesome. This guy probably knows a little bit about something or other, but let's actually talk about improving your own teams. How can we actually apply some of this to improve our own response and our own methodology? You can use ours, that's great, but let's talk about what we can do for yours. Security, especially incident response, should be a constantly evolving, repeating process. There's no way around it. You start with looking for malware, identifying, trying to find out what's going on. If you do, you remediate it, you clean it up, and then you try to prevent it. You implement new controls to stop it from happening again. You have lessons learned meetings to talk about it, these different types of things for monitoring. And then you go back to monitoring. So while this is a linear graph, I feel like it should really be a circle to show that this never ends. You should all be vigilant and always be looking. And how do we do that? You know, how can we improve our own? This is probably going to be my least popular slide. Documentation. You need documentation to do this properly. Unfortunately, if you want to have an incident response team, you need to have an incident response plan. So even if you're a small company or a large company, you need to have some kind of policy that shows you what to do if a horrible event should occur, right? Otherwise, what's going to happen are a bunch of people are going to panic, you're going to make hasty decisions, and you're going to waste a lot of time and money. Time for you, money for the company. It becomes a real problem. So you do have an incident response plan, right? Because if you don't, I would highly suggest at least go and grab a SANS template or a NIST template. You know, you Google sample incident response plan, you can get a very basic start. It can show you at least what the main categories are, you know, your roles and responsibilities, your escalation points, all of these different things that should formalize any proper incident response team. And even if you don't have a response team, even smaller environments that are just a security guy or even just an IT team, they should still have this same type of policy in place. That way, should something happen, when management comes to you down the road and says, well, why did you panic and why did you wait 48 hours to fix it? You can say, well, we did our proper testing policies. We applied it via X, Y, and Z documentation that we have. If you don't like it, we can revise it for the next time. Rather than, well, you know, we just we reacted at how we needed to and, you know, we got lucky. That kind of thing. So if you have an incident response plan, the other thing you need to do is you need to actually read it. I go to a lot of clients where, oh yeah, we have an incident response plan. Hey, where is it? Hold on. And then you pull out a drawer and then open it up. You could tell it hasn't been opened since the day it was printed. You could ask them, hey, well, what page is your escalation procedures on? I don't know. Yeah, you got to actually read it. There's no real way around it. It's kind of boring. Don't get me wrong. I hate documentation. I'm a techie engineer through and through, but there's no way around it. You have to have an IR plan. You have to actually read it. And then not only that, but it should probably be updated. If you look at it, and it was last updated 4 years ago, how many of you in your environment from 4 years ago have the same tools and technology in place? I'm willing to bet a lot of you have newer security mechanisms or other controls, and you should always be updating your incident response plan to actually follow the resources and tools that you have in your environment. That, and the other big one that's not on here is I find contact lists are always out of date. So I'll help a client out and I'll say, hey, you need to let legal know that there's a potential data breach and you need to work on a communication plan. And they're like, oh, well, let me see who's responsible for that. And then they call a phone number. Oh, that person hasn't worked here in a year and a half. Okay, so these are all things to kind of, while it's not my favorite thing in the world, this will make you faster in your response. This will speed up everything. Tools and technology. Okay, a small bank with a very small budget is not going to have the same budget as a biotech that is, protecting billions of dollars worth of data. So the reality is you have to look at what's reasonable for your team. Are there security tools that would make your life easier? Is there something that's going to reduce the amount of time you're doing manual analysis? The idea is you want to automate and use intelligent response to identify anything you can and remediate it as quickly as possible. And when you're testing out tools, which you should all do, I'm a firm believer, I'm vendor agnostic, even though I work for a vendor. You should test anything that you're buying. I don't care if it's my tool or somebody else's tool. Use real world scenarios, data, whatever it is, and throw it at it. See if it performs the way you would expect it to and the way you want it to. And if it doesn't, look at another tool. There's no way around it. And if an incident does occur, it sounds a little bad, but it's true. Use the incident to gain leverage to get managerial buy-in to buy more tools or manpower or process, whatever it is. If there's a big incident and it's costing your executive leadership team $100,000 to fix, this is the perfect time to say, hey, look, I need this $100,000 tool in addition, and this will never happen again. Or I need manpower, or I need policy and procedure, whatever it might be. Leverage the incident to actually get traction with your management team. And then lastly, with that, smaller companies aren't going to be able to do everything themselves. You're not always going to have a 10-man security team or a 10-person security team. Leverage partnerships with vendors and relationships with others that can provide you with services or tools to help you do your job and make your life easier. Whether it's pen testing or IR or whatever it might be, you want to have those partnerships. That way it's not all on you. And that way if something does go wrong, you have somebody to at least point at as well. Shouldn't say that. All right. Like I said, it's still early for me, so my filter's a little off. Educating incident response teams. If you do have an incident response team, these are the people that need your training budget. These are the people that should be getting certifications, staying up to date with the latest trends and technology. If there's one group that you should be spending money on education and certification, it's the IR team, because this stuff evolves so quickly that if you're not prepared for it, your response team is going to say, oh, well, I've never even heard of that, or what is that tool? Or I need to dump memory and what am I supposed to do? So you need them to be at least up to date with those. What I'm looking for when I'm hiring for my incident response team is passion. I don't care if you know everything there is to know about a topic. That's great if you do, but I want somebody that's interested and actually passionate about what they're doing and why, right? Those are the people that are going to spend the late nights actually solving your incident or looking down the rabbit hole trying to find some weird threat actor. Those are the people you want, and those are the people you should keep by offering them training. The reality is, a company that invests in training will save money the first time an incident occurs. I don't have a statistic for that, but I would argue that day and night. And then lastly, you need to test your response plan and your team. So any team is great. You can have an incident response team, but if you're sitting in the room and, it's been 9 months since you've had any kind of incident and, you're browsing Reddit, it's not going to help you. You need to actually be able to sit down and have an exercise. You want to walk through with not just the security team, but what I call extended CSIR, your HR, your legal, executive leadership. Get all these people in a room. And even if you're talking about a PowerPoint incident of malware infected system X, what would we do? That's fine. You just need to get people used to the idea that there's an incident and how to respond to it. Once you've done that a couple years in a row, the next time you can actually get better and say, hey, here's an actual log file for your security team to look at. We've released malware into a virtual machine. Go respond to it. You can go from the very basic all the way up to a very advanced, what I call a simulation. So our team helps with a lot of those. I do a lot of those types of exercises, but the goal is to test your team and then lastly, create playbooks. So if you're handling the same type of incident more than 3 times a year, create a little flowchart of the main topics of things to do, solve those problems, and now you're significantly more efficient at doing it. So in conclusion, the threat landscape has made a very large turn for the worse. We have to stay ahead of the attackers. You need to be preventative, be proactive, and incident response needs to be fast and relevant. Any questions? Yeah.
After we talk about phishing reconnaissance,
Mm-hmm.
you said something about how they're using phone systems now. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. We call it vishing, which I don't think is very creative, but it's basically using voice. They will call secretaries, they will call administrative assistants, people that have information but aren't necessarily always trained to be the most secure, and they will say, oh, hey, I want to speak to the CEO, and then, oh, he's not available. Oh, is he traveling? Where's he at? And get different pieces of information that way. Or, oh, who's the second point of contact for this team? Or, different distribution lists, anything that they can use to get context to make them sound more legitimate for a social engineering attack. So sometimes you're not getting, somebody's not going to say, hey, the user's password is XYZ, but they might give you enough details to maybe call help desk and say, I am traveling to China right now. I'm locked out of my account. My social security number is this. I need you to reset my password. So those are the types of things that we're seeing quite a bit of. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.